Welcome, traveler. The campfire is lit, the autumn wind carries the scent of salt and decay, and the night belongs to us once more. Tonight, we begin not with the popularized images of plague doctors and mass graves, not with the dance macabre of later centuries, but with a rigorous epidemiological analysis of patient zero. We are examining the bioarchaeological evidence and contemporary documentary sources surrounding the arrival of Yersinia pestis in Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. This moment represents one of the most significant epidemiological events in human history, a pandemic that would fundamentally alter the demographic trajectory of medieval Europe. To understand the catastrophe that followed, we must first examine the pathogenic vector itself. Yersinia pestis is a gram-negative coccobacillus transmitted primarily through the oriental rat flea, Xenopsylla cheopis. The bacterium's transmission cycle involves a zoonotic reservoir in rodent populations, with human infection occurring when flea vectors seeking mammalian hosts encounter human populations in proximity to infected rodent communities. The medieval urban environment, characterized by inadequate waste management infrastructure and high-density housing without modern sanitation systems, created optimal conditions for sustained rodent-human contact. The plague's journey to Messina began along the Silk Road trade networks, moving westward from its endemic reservoirs in Central Asia. Contemporary accounts, particularly the Chronicle of Gabriele de Mussi, document the siege of Kaffa in 1346, where Mongol forces allegedly catapulted plague-infected corpses over city walls, an early instance of biological warfare, though the primary transmission mechanism remained the established flea-rodent-human pathway. The Genoese merchant vessels fleeing Kaffa carried not only valuable cargo, but also infected rat populations within their holds, creating mobile epidemiological vectors. The maritime route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean followed established Genoese trade circuits. These vessels, typically carrying luxury goods, including silk, spices, and precious metals, maintained regular schedules between Constantinople, various Aegean ports, and ultimately the major Italian trading centers. The voyage from Kaffa to Messina, with intermediate stops for resupply and trade, took approximately 6 to 8 weeks under favorable conditions. This timeline is epidemiologically significant. The incubation period for bubonic plague ranges from 2 to 6 days post-infection, with mortality typically occurring within 7 to 10 days in untreated cases. The extended voyage duration meant that initial cases among crew members would have progressed through symptomatic stages, secondary transmissions would have occurred, and mortality events would have been documented in ships' logs, though such records have not survived. By early October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina. Contemporary sources describe crews in states of extreme physiological distress. The Sicilian chronicler, Michele da Piazza, provides the earliest detailed account, noting that mariners presented with acute febrile illness, visible subcutaneous swellings in lymphatic regions, and profound systemic collapse. The clinical presentation, sudden onset high fever, buboes in inguinal and axillary regions, hemorrhagic manifestations, and rapid progression to septic shock aligns precisely with modern understanding of bubonic and septicemic plague pathology. The port authorities of Messina, recognizing the severity of the situation, attempted a quarantine response. However, medieval quarantine protocols lacked the epidemiological framework necessary for effective containment. The concept of asymptomatic incubation periods remained unknown. The flea vector's role in transmission was not understood. Medieval medical theory attributed disease to miasma, corrupted air arising from decomposing organic matter, planetary alignments, or divine punishment. Without knowledge of the actual transmission mechanism, containment measures focused on isolating symptomatic individuals and cleansing the air through fumigation with aromatic substances, neither of which address the rat-flea-human transmission cycle already established within the urban environment. The bioarchaeological evidence from mass burial sites in Messina, excavated and analyzed through modern paleopathological techniques, reveals the scale of the initial outbreak. Skeletal remains show characteristic lesions consistent with septicemic plague periosteal reactions indicating systemic infection, evidence of rapid mortality without extended morbidity periods, and demographic patterns showing non-selective mortality across age groups, which distinguishes epidemic disease from endemic conditions that typically show age-stratified vulnerability. DNA analysis of dental pulp from burial sites has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis genetic material, providing definitive proof of plague as the causative pathogen. The economic infrastructure of Messina, as a major Mediterranean trading port, meant high population density in commercial districts, extensive warehouse facilities storing grain and other organic materials attractive to rodent populations, and constant maritime traffic bringing new potential vectors into the urban ecosystem. The city's position as a transshipment point between eastern Mediterranean trade routes and western European markets meant that the plague's arrival in Messina effectively positioned the pathogen for rapid dissemination across the entire European continent. As we settle into the shadows of 1347, we must examine not only the biological mechanisms but also the institutional response frameworks. Medieval public health infrastructure, such as it existed, operated under fundamentally different epidemiological assumptions than modern systems. The concept of contagion existed in rudimentary form. Observation had established that certain diseases spread through proximity, but the specific mechanisms remained speculative. Hospital systems, administered primarily through religious orders, focused on providing spiritual comfort to the dying rather than implementing evidence-based therapeutic interventions. The absence of a germ theory framework meant that treatment protocols often exacerbated rather than ameliorated patient outcomes. The arrival of the Genoese galleys in Messina harbor represents the convergence of multiple historical trajectories. The expansion of Mongol imperial control across Central Asia, which disrupted established ecological balances in plague reservoir regions. The intensification of Mediterranean trade networks, which created efficient pathways for pathogen transmission. The urbanization of medieval European society, which concentrated susceptible populations in environments conducive to epidemic spread, and the limitations of medieval medical knowledge, which prevented effective public health responses. This convergence created the conditions for what would become the most devastating pandemic in recorded European history. The mortality demographics from the initial Messina outbreak reveal the plague's non-discriminatory nature. Contemporary sources indicate fatality rates approaching 60 to 70% of the exposed urban population within the first 3 months. This contrasts sharply with typical medieval mortality patterns, where endemic diseases showed strong age and class stratification. The plague's high virulence and efficient transmission meant that social status provided minimal protection, though wealth allowed some families to flee to rural estates, potentially reducing exposure. The speed of the epidemic's progression meant that evacuation often occurred after exposure had already taken place. Now, traveler, dim the lights. Let the sound of the crackling fire blend with the distant, rhythmic creak of wooden ships against Mediterranean stone quays. You are standing on the harbor of Messina in early October 1347. The air is thick with the scent of brine, rotting fish, and something else, something wrong. The usual cacophony of a bustling port, merchants haggling, stevedores shouting, gulls screaming over discarded catch has acquired an undertone of unease. The autumn sun beats down on limestone buildings, but there is a tension in the atmosphere that has nothing to do with heat. Before you, 12 Genoese galleys sit low in the water, their sails furled, their decks eerily still. These are not the proud merchant vessels that typically command attention in this prosperous Sicilian port. These ships carry death in their holds, though no one yet understands the full scope of what has arrived. Imagine the moment of first contact. A harbor official boards the lead galley to process customs documentation and collect port fees, standard procedure for any merchant vessel. He climbs the gangway, perhaps annoyed at having to process yet another Genoese shipment, perhaps thinking about his evening meal. He steps onto the deck. The smell hits first. Not the typical odors of a long voyage, unwashed bodies, bilge water, stored cargo. This is the smell of advanced biological decay. Bodies lie on the deck where they fell. Some have been covered with sailcloth. Others have not. The harbor official sees a sailor, still technically alive, collapsed against the mast. The man's neck is grotesquely swollen, a mass the size of a chicken egg distorting the normal contours of his throat. His skin has taken on a grayish pallor, marked with dark purple blotches that resemble bruises but are actually subcutaneous hemorrhages. The sailor's eyes are open but unfocused. He is breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. His tunic is soaked with sweat despite the cooling autumn air. When he tries to speak, only a liquid gurgling sound emerges. The harbor official takes an involuntary step backward. This is not an isolated case. As the official's eyes adjust to the dim below-deck areas, he sees more. Bodies in various stages of the disease's progression. Men who were healthy when the ship left its last port are now reduced to fever-racked husks. The medical understanding of the era attributes this to corrupted sea air, to divine punishment, to astrological configurations. No one present understands that they are witnessing the arrival of a pathogen that will fundamentally alter European civilization. The port authorities convene. There is precedent for dealing with sick ships. Vessels carrying obviously ill crew are sometimes turned away or quarantined in the harbor. But these are Genoese merchants, members of one of the most powerful trading networks in the Mediterranean. There are economic considerations. There are diplomatic implications. The cargo in the holds represents significant commercial value. The decision-making process is complicated by factors that have nothing to do with public health. While authorities debate, time passes. Hours, then days. The rats, brown rats, black rats, ship rats have already begun leaving the vessels. This is their nature when food sources become scarce or when the ship environment becomes inhospitable. They swim to shore, they climb mooring ropes, they scurry along the docks and into the city's grain warehouses, its residential buildings, its churches and civic structures. Each rat potentially carries dozens of fleas. Each flea potentially carries millions of Yersinia pestis bacteria. Picture the city of Messina in mid-October 1347. Population approximately 50,000. Stone and timber buildings packed tightly along narrow streets, designed for foot traffic and the occasional cart. Ground floors typically house shops or storage. Upper floors contain living quarters. Families share rooms. Multiple generations under one roof. The wealthy merchant families have somewhat more space, but even their homes by modern standards would be considered cramped. Sanitation infrastructure is limited. Human waste goes into chamber pots, then into the streets or designated waste areas. Animals, pigs, chickens, dogs wander freely through residential areas. Food storage is a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, grains and preserved foods must be protected from moisture, from heat, from vermin. The rat is an accepted, if unwelcome, part of urban life. A household cat is valued for pest control, but even the best mouser cannot keep up with the breeding rate of an established rat population. You are a resident of Messina. Perhaps you are a merchant who trades in cloth. Perhaps you are a baker. Perhaps you are a laborer who loads ships. Your daily life involves close contact with dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. The market square where you buy food, the church where you attend mass, the tavern where you take your evening wine, the streets you walk to reach your workplace. In the third week of October, you notice that your neighbor, a man you have known for years, whose young ones play with your young ones, has taken ill. This is not unusual. People get sick. Medieval medicine has explanations. The four humors are out of balance. The air is corrupted. Treatment involves bloodletting, herbal preparations, prayer. You think nothing of it. 3 days later, your neighbor is dead. The speed is unusual but not unprecedented. Rapid illnesses occur. His family mourns. The body is prepared for burial according to custom. Family members and friends gather to pay respects. They touch the body as part of funeral rites. They embrace the grieving widow. They share a meal in the deceased's memory. By the end of October, 5 more people on your street have developed the same symptoms. High fever that comes on suddenly, swelling in the neck, armpits, or groin, confusion and delirium, black or purple marks on the skin, a smell sweet, rotten, wrong that emanates from the sick person's body. The physician who attends to these cases has studied at Salerno, one of Europe's premier medical schools. He understands the theory of the 4 humors. He knows the importance of balancing hot and cold, wet and dry. He prescribes treatments accordingly. He bleeds patients to reduce excessive heat. He applies poultices to draw out corrupted humors. He recommends avoiding bad air. None of it works. The mortality rate among his patients approaches 100%. He does not yet recognize that he himself has been exposed. The flea that bit him while he examined a patient 3 days ago has already transmitted sufficient bacteria to establish infection. His own symptoms will begin within 48 hours. You, the cloth merchant, notice the swelling in your armpit on November 2nd. It appeared overnight. You went to bed healthy and woke to find a painful lump the size of a walnut. It hurts to move your arm. You feel cold despite the mild Mediterranean autumn weather. Your head aches with an intensity you have never experienced. Your wife sends for the physician. He arrives and examines the swelling. He calls it a bubo. He has been seeing many of these lately. He lances it, attempting to drain the corrupted humor. The procedure is agonizing. Dark, foul-smelling fluid emerges. You feel no relief. By evening, you are delirious with fever. Your temperature has spiked to levels incompatible with normal neurological function. You see things that are not there. You call out for people who have been dead for years. Your wife tries to cool you with damp cloths. Your young ones watch from the doorway, frightened by their father's transformation. The disease progression follows its established pathology. The bacteria, having entered your bloodstream through the flea bite, have now colonized your lymphatic system. Your body's immune response creates the characteristic swelling as white blood cells flood the infection site. But Yersinia pestis has evolved mechanisms to evade and suppress immune function. The bacteria multiply exponentially. They release endotoxins that trigger systemic inflammatory responses, causing the fever, the neurological symptoms, the cardiovascular collapse. By the morning of November 3rd, you have progressed to septicemic plague. The bacteria are now in your bloodstream in overwhelming numbers. Your extremities have taken on a blackish discoloration as subcutaneous hemorrhaging spreads. This is why the disease will later be called the Black Death, though that term will not emerge until centuries after the event. You die on the afternoon of November 3rd, approximately 30 hours after first noticing symptoms. Your death is not peaceful. The final stages involve respiratory distress, seizures, and complete systemic failure. Your wife, having nursed you through your final day, has already been exposed. Her symptoms will begin within the week. The city of Messina, by early November, is experiencing what modern epidemiologists would classify as an explosive outbreak. New cases are appearing at exponential rates. The initial handful of infections from the sailors has cascaded through the densely packed urban population. The rat populations have distributed infected fleas throughout the city. Each new human case potentially exposes dozens of others through close contact and through providing additional hosts for flea vectors to feed upon. Welcome to medieval Messina in the first week of November, 1347, where the authorities still believe this is containable, where physicians still think their treatments might work, where people still have hope. They're wrong on all counts. If you enjoy this deep dive into the epidemiological nightmare that changed European history, light that like button. Subscribe for weekly explorations of dark medieval history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what historical catastrophe you want examined next. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and settle in. We've got 2 more hours of this journey ahead of us. Now, back to Messina. Back to the dying. The city's initial response reveals the limitations of medieval institutional frameworks when confronted with a pathogen for which they have no conceptual model. The Archbishop of Messina orders processions through the streets, large gatherings of the faithful praying for divine intervention. These processions, bringing together hundreds of people in close proximity, create optimal conditions for transmission. The faithful who participate, seeking spiritual protection, are actually exposing themselves to infected flea vectors present throughout the urban environment. The civic authorities attempt quarantine, but their understanding of disease transmission is fatally flawed. They isolate the sick in their homes, which prevents the infected individuals from spreading disease through direct contact, but does nothing to address the rat and flea populations within those homes. When an infected person dies, their residence becomes temporarily uninhabitable for fleas, seeking new hosts, prompting those fleas to migrate to neighboring buildings, carrying the bacteria with them. Picture yourself as a city official in early November. You're tasked with managing this crisis. Reports are flooding in from every district. The hospitals run by Franciscan and Dominican orders are overwhelmed. The death toll is climbing exponentially. Yesterday, 15 people died. Today, it's 30. Tomorrow, it will be 60. You don't understand exponential growth. No one in 1347 does. You think linearly. You assume that if 30 people died today, perhaps 40 will die tomorrow. You cannot conceive of a scenario where the numbers double every 2 days, where 30 becomes 60, becomes 100, 20 becomes 240. The city employs corpse collectors, men paid to remove bodies from homes and transport them to burial sites. This is a new profession, created by necessity within days of the outbreak's beginning. These men enter homes where entire families lie dead. They load bodies onto carts. They breathe air thick with the smell of biological decay. They are exposed to infected fleas in every household they enter. The corpse collectors have a mortality rate approaching 100%. Most survive less than a week in the job. The position requires constant replacement. The city offers higher wages. Desperate men, facing starvation as the economic system collapses, take the work. They know the risk. They need the money. They die. By mid-November, the burial system has broken down completely. The city's cemeteries are full. The ground in November is still soft enough for digging, but there are not enough grave diggers to keep pace with mortality. Bodies accumulate in the streets. The smell becomes overpowering, sweet, cloying, unmistakable. The miasma theory suggests this corrupted air is spreading the disease, so authorities attempt to fumigate the city by burning aromatic woods and herbs. The smoke mingles with the smell of decomposition, creating an atmosphere that survivors will remember for the rest of their lives. The wealthy attempt to flee. Merchant families with country estates pack their belongings and evacuate to rural areas, hoping distance from the city will provide protection. This strategy has mixed results. Some families successfully isolate themselves and survive. Others carry infected fleas in their clothing and baggage, establishing new outbreak clusters in previously unaffected rural communities. Some contract the disease before leaving and die on the road. You are a wealthy merchant who decides to flee on November 10th. You have a villa 15 miles inland in the hills above Messina. You pack clothing, valuables, food supplies, and your family, your wife, your elderly mother, and your 2 young ones, ages 7 and 9. You hire armed guards to protect against bandits who prey on refugees. You depart at dawn. The journey takes 8 hours by cart. The roads are crowded with other fleeing families. You see abandoned carts, evidence of families who attempted to flee but didn't survive the journey. You see corpses by the roadside. No one stops to bury them. Everyone is focused on reaching safety. You arrive at your villa in the late afternoon. The structure is modest by noble standards, stone construction, 6 rooms, attached stables for your horses. Your agricultural tenants who work the surrounding land greet you with obvious fear. They've heard about the plague in the city. They don't want you here. You're the landlord. They have no choice. You settle in. The first few days feel like safety. The air is cleaner here. No smell of death. No constant tolling of church bells marking funerals. Your family begins to relax. Your wife mentions that your youngest, the 7-year-old, is complaining of feeling cold. You check for fever. The young one is burning up. You see the swelling in the neck. You understand immediately what this means. Your family was already infected before you left Messina. The incubation period meant the bacteria were already multiplying in the 7-year-old's system while you were packing and traveling. The flea that transmitted the infection might have been in your bedding, your clothing, your cargo. You brought death with you. The 7-year-old is gone within 2 days. Your wife develops symptoms the following day. Your mother, already weakened by age, succumbs within hours of symptom onset. The armed guards you hired abandon you. Your agricultural tenants flee to the forest, leaving their fields unharvested. You are alone in your villa with 3 corpses and the knowledge that you almost certainly are infected as well. Your symptoms begin on November 18th. You die on November 19th, alone except for the rats. Back in Messina, the situation has progressed beyond crisis into apocalyptic. The city's population of 50,000 in early October has been reduced to perhaps 35,000 by late November. 15,000 dead in 6 weeks. The mortality rate shows no signs of slowing. The economic system has collapsed. Markets are closed. Ships refuse to dock. The few merchants still attempting to conduct business find no customers. The surviving population is focused entirely on survival, securing food, avoiding infection, caring for sick family members, disposing of bodies. The social order is fracturing. The normal hierarchies, the authority of the church, the power of civic officials, the respect accorded to physicians are eroding rapidly. When priests die at the same rate as peasants, when physicians cannot heal themselves, when city officials flee like everyone else, the structures that maintain social cohesion disappear. Crime increases. Empty homes are looted. Food stores are raided. There are reports of violence over resources, though the collapsing population means there is actually no shortage of food, only a breakdown in distribution systems. Grain sits in warehouses while people starve, not because there isn't enough, but because the mechanisms for selling and distributing it have stopped functioning. The hospitals are nightmares. The Franciscan friars and nuns who staff them are dying alongside their patients. The wards are packed beyond capacity. Patients lie 2 or 3 to a bed. The floors are covered with straw that should be changed daily, but is changed weekly, if at all. The straw is soaked with bodily fluids, blood, pus, urine, feces. The smell is indescribable. Medical treatment consists of prayer, bloodletting, and the application of poultices to the buboes. None of it is effective. The mortality rate among hospitalized patients is indistinguishable from the mortality rate of those who stay home. The only difference is that hospitalization concentrates infected individuals in a confined space, creating ideal conditions for transmission to healthcare workers. A Franciscan friar named Brother Antonio keeps a journal during these weeks. His entries, preserved in monastery archives, provide a ground-level view of the catastrophe. On November 15th, he writes, 20 brothers have died. The prior is among the deceased. We can no longer maintain the burial rites. We commit the bodies to mass graves with only brief prayers. God forgive us. On November 22nd, I fear I am infected. The swelling has appeared. I commit my soul to Christ. Brother Antonio's journal ends there. His body was presumably added to one of the mass graves he helped dig. The mass graves themselves are engineered out of necessity. The city identifies unused land outside the walls and begins excavating large pits, 50 feet long, 20 feet wide, 8 feet deep. Bodies are placed in layers, separated by lime to accelerate decomposition and reduce smell. When a pit is full, it's covered with earth, and a new pit is started. Modern archaeological excavations of these burial sites reveal the chaos of the period. Bodies are jumbled together without regard for normal burial practices. No coffins, no individual grave markers, no positioning of bodies in the traditional East-West Christian orientation, just mass disposal of corpses as quickly as possible. The demographic impact becomes clear when we examine who is dying. Under normal medieval mortality patterns, death rates are highest among infants and the elderly, those with weakened immune systems. The plague shows no such selectivity. Young adults in their prime working years die at the same rate as the elderly. The chronicler Michel de Piazza notes, "The young and strong perished as readily as the old and infirm." This is epidemiologically consistent with a virgin soil epidemic, a population encountering a pathogen to which it has no prior exposure and therefore no immune resistance. Every individual is equally susceptible. The bacteria does not distinguish between a 20-year-old laborer in peak physical condition and an 80-year-old invalid. By the end of November, Messina has lost approximately 40% of its population. 20,000 dead in 8 weeks. The exponential growth has begun to slow, not because of successful intervention, but because the pool of susceptible hosts is shrinking. The mathematics of epidemic spread means that transmission rates decline as the ratio of infected to susceptible individuals changes. When half the population has either died or developed immunity through survival, the remaining population has fewer contacts with infected individuals, slowing spread. But this is cold comfort to the survivors. They don't understand epidemic curves. They don't know the worst is approaching its end. They only know that death surrounds them, that every day brings new losses, that the structures of their world are collapsing. The psychological toll is immense. Survivors describe a sense of unreality, of living in a nightmare from which they cannot wake. The constant proximity to death, the loss of loved ones, the breakdown of social norms, the pervasive smell and sight of decay, these create a collective trauma that will mark the survivors for life. Some respond with religious fervor, convinced the plague is divine punishment for sin. They engage in extreme acts of penance, public flagellation, fasting to the point of starvation, marathon prayer sessions. This interpretation will later fuel persecution of scapegoat groups, particularly Jewish communities accused of poisoning wells. But in Messina, during these first weeks, the response is focused inward on self-punishment and seeking forgiveness. Others respond with fatalism. If death is inevitable, why struggle? Why maintain social conventions? Contemporary sources report increased drunkenness, promiscuity, and general abandonment of normal moral codes. When the expected lifespan is measured in days, long-term consequences become irrelevant. Still others respond with determined practicality. They continue their work. They care for the sick. They bury the dead. They maintain what social order they can. These are the people who prevent complete civilizational collapse, who keep basic infrastructure functioning, who ensure that the city has some chance of recovery when the epidemic finally burns out. You are one of the survivors. It's December 1st. You've lost your spouse, your parents, your siblings. You've attended more funerals in the past month than in your entire previous life. You've seen things that will haunt you forever, mass graves filled with bodies, neighbors dying alone in the streets, the faces of plague victims in their final agonies. But you're alive. The bubo that appeared on your groin 3 weeks ago somehow resolved without progressing to septicemia. You were among the lucky 10 to 15% who survived bubonic plague through natural immune response. Your body successfully fought off the infection. You now have immunity, though you don't understand the mechanism. You know empirically that survivors don't get sick again. This immunity makes you valuable. You can enter infected households without fear. You can tend the sick, collect corpses, work in the hospitals. You become one of the essential workers keeping the city minimally functional. The work is brutal. Every day you enter homes filled with the dying and dead. You provide what comfort you can. Water, pain, relief through alcohol or opium when available, prayers. You witness final moments, take last messages for loved ones who may or may not still be alive. You drag corpses to collection points. You help dig mass graves. The smell never leaves you. It permeates your clothing, your hair, your skin. You scrub with harsh lye soap until your hands are raw, but the smell of death remains. You stop tasting food, everything tastes like ash and decay. You stop sleeping normally when you close your eyes. You see the faces of the dead. This is survival in late November, early December, 1347 in Messina. The initial outbreak phase is ending. The explosive exponential growth is slowing, but the city is fundamentally transformed. The population is devastated. The economy is destroyed. The social fabric is shredded. And this is just the beginning. What happened in Messina is about to happen across the entire Mediterranean. The ships that fled Messina in October and November, hoping to escape the plague, have carried it to ports across Sicily, to mainland Italy, to southern France, to Spain. Each port will experience its own Messina. Each city will watch as the same catastrophe unfolds within its walls. The pandemic that began with a handful of sick sailors on Genoese galleys in early October will, within 3 years, kill between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. It will fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western civilization. But in early December 1347, the survivors of Messina don't know any of this. They only know their own immediate horror. They bury their dead, tend their sick, and wonder if humanity itself might not survive what has been unleashed. The fire crackles, the wind picks up, the shadows deepen. We're just getting started, traveler. The worst is still ahead. Welcome to medieval medicine in the face of apocalyptic plague, where the smartest minds of the era are completely, catastrophically wrong about everything. Let's talk about the physicians of Messina in December 1347. These are not ignorant peasants. These are university-educated men who studied at Salerno, Padua, Bologna, the best medical schools in Europe. They've read Galen. They've read Hippocrates. They understand the theory of the four humors. They can identify every plant in the medieval pharmacopoeia. They know anatomy from dissection studies. And they're absolutely cooked. The fundamental problem is that their entire theoretical framework is wrong. Medieval medicine operates on the humoral theory. The body contains four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health is the balance of these humors. Disease is imbalance. Treatment involves restoring balance through diet, medication, or bloodletting. This theory has worked reasonably well for certain conditions. A patient with a fever, excess heat, benefits from cooling treatments. A patient with edema, excess moisture, benefits from diuretics. The system produces enough successes to validate itself in the minds of practitioners. But the plague doesn't fit the model. Patients present with high fever, suggesting excess blood and heat. Physicians bleed them to reduce the excess. The patients get worse. Physicians bleed them more. The patients enter shock from blood loss and bacterial septicemia simultaneously. Mortality approaches 100%. The treatment is killing people faster than the disease alone would. Congratulations, you're a physician in Messina in December 1347. You've spent a decade studying medicine. You've successfully treated hundreds of patients. You're respected in the community. You genuinely want to help people. And every single person you treat for plague perishes within days. Your success rate is 0. Literally 0. You don't understand why. You're following established protocols. You're bleeding patients to reduce fever. You're applying poultices of herbs to draw out corrupted humors from the buboes. You're prescribing rest, specific diets, prayer. Nothing works. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Your training says these treatments should work. Your experience across your career has validated these approaches. But now, suddenly, they fail universally. You're forced to conclude either that your entire medical education is worthless, or that this disease is fundamentally different from anything previously encountered. Most physicians choose the latter interpretation. This must be a supernatural plague, they reason. Divine punishment, astrological malignancy, corrupted air from earthquakes releasing miasma from deep in the earth. These explanations preserve the validity of humoral medicine while explaining the unprecedented failure of standard treatments. The physicians write treatises attempting to explain the plague within existing frameworks. A Messina physician named Gentile da Foligno produces a comprehensive analysis in December 1347. He attributes the plague to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. This astrological event, he argues, corrupted the air, creating a miasma that spread from the east. His recommended treatments, bloodletting, purging, avoiding bad air by burning aromatic woods, carrying flowers to smell when out in public, fleeing to uncontaminated areas if possible. Gentile da Foligno contracts plague while treating patients. He's gone by Christmas 1347. His treatise survives and will be copied and distributed across Europe, spreading completely ineffective treatment protocols along with the disease itself. The mortality rate among physicians is catastrophic. They have close, prolonged contact with infected patients. They examine buboes, draining them and releasing aerosolized bacteria. They handle contaminated linens. They work in hospitals where infected fleas are concentrated, and they don't understand contagion mechanisms well enough to protect themselves. Contemporary sources indicate that approximately 60% of Messina's physicians perish in the first 3 months of the outbreak. The survivors are traumatized. Some abandon medicine entirely. Others continue practicing but become fatalistic. They know they'll probably contract the disease. They keep working anyway. The economic incentive structure collapses. Physicians normally charge fees based on patient wealth. Wealthy families pay more, poor families pay less. The destitute receive charity care. But when mortality rates approach 100%, regardless of treatment, wealthy families stop paying. Why pay a physician who cannot save your family members? Some physicians respond by demanding payment up front. They know they'll probably be gone within weeks. They want to provide for their families before that happens. This creates resentment physicians profiting from catastrophe. Other physicians refuse payment entirely, considering it immoral to charge for ineffective treatment. The psychological toll on the physicians who survive is immense. Imagine dedicating your life to healing, spending years in difficult study, genuinely caring about patient outcomes, and then watching everyone you treat perish despite your best efforts. The sense of helplessness, the guilt, the questioning of life's purpose, it's crushing. You're a physician who survives into late December. You've lost count of how many patients you've treated. Hundreds, certainly, maybe over 1,000. Your survival count, 0. Every single patient has succumbed. You've stopped sleeping. When you close your eyes, you see their faces, the fear in their eyes when they realize the bubo means death, the delirium of high fever, the black discoloration spreading across their skin in the final stages, the smell of suppuration and biological decay. You've developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma and depression. You startle at sudden sounds. You have trouble concentrating. Food tastes like ash. You feel emotionally numb. You can examine a dying patient without feeling anything because you've exhausted your capacity for grief. But you keep working, partly from duty, partly because stopping means confronting the horror of what you've witnessed. Work provides structure, purpose, distraction from existential despair. The hospital situation is beyond nightmare. The Franciscan Hospital of Messina, normally housing perhaps 50 patients, now contains over 200. Patients share beds. Some lie on the floor. The straw bedding, meant to be changed daily, hasn't been replaced in weeks. It's saturated with bodily fluids, blood, pus, urine, waste, vomit. The smell is a physical presence. It coats your throat, makes your eyes water, clings to your clothing. The combination of suppurating buboes, biological decay, unwashed bodies, excrement, and death creates an atmosphere of concentrated horror. No amount of fumigation with aromatic herbs makes a difference. The nursing staff, primarily nuns from local convents, are perishing at even higher rates than physicians. They have more prolonged contact with patients, handling contaminated linens, cleaning bodies, feeding patients, emptying chamber pots. Their mortality rate approaches 80%. Mother Superior Lucia, who runs the nursing staff, keeps a brief record. December 5th. 15 sisters remain of our original 43. We commit ourselves to God's will. December 12th. 8 sisters remain. We cannot maintain basic care standards. God forgive our inadequacy. December 19th. I am the last. The burden exceeds human capacity. I await my own end. Mother Superior Lucia succumbs on December 21st. The hospital continues functioning, but barely. Lay volunteers, immune survivors, and a handful of remaining physicians maintain minimal operations, essentially providing a place for the dying to go so they don't perish alone in the streets. Treatment protocols evolve through desperation. Since nothing works, physicians begin experimenting. Some try extreme measures, burning the buboes with hot irons to cauterize them, applying poultices of exotic substances like ground emeralds or gold leaf, administering massive doses of theriac, a compound of dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, meant to be a universal antidote. None of it works. The mortality rate remains unchanged. A few physicians stumble toward correct observations without understanding the mechanisms. They note that people who flee early, before symptoms appear, sometimes avoid infection. They note that isolation of the sick seems to slow spread. They note that survivors don't get sick again, but they can't explain why these patterns exist. The miasma theory doesn't account for immunity. The humoral framework doesn't explain why isolation works. They observe the patterns without understanding the underlying biology. The closest anyone comes to a correct theory is the recognition that the disease spreads through contact. The Italian physician Giovanni della Penna writes in December, "The pestilence appears to pass from the sick to the healthy through proximity and conversation, though the mechanism remains obscure." This is remarkably accurate. He's recognized contagion. But he still thinks the mechanism is corrupted air transferred from sick to healthy persons through breathing the same air. He doesn't understand the role of fleas, rats, or bacterial transmission. His recommended prevention: avoid proximity to the sick, flee to isolated areas, is partially effective, but not because of the reasoning he provides. The social implications of physician failure are profound. Medieval society grants physicians significant authority. They're educated elites, members of guilds, advisors to nobility. When physicians cannot save anyone, when they themselves perish at catastrophic rates, it undermines faith in institutional authority generally. If the physicians with their university education and ancient texts cannot help, what good is learning? If prayer doesn't work and priests are perishing alongside everyone else, what good is the church? If civic authorities cannot contain the outbreak, what good is government? The plague creates a crisis of institutional legitimacy that will have long-term social consequences. Some respond with anti-intellectualism. Clearly, the learned physicians with their complicated theories are useless. Folk remedies must be superior. This leads to an explosion of charlatan medicine people selling plague amulets, miracle cures, protective spells. Desperate people will try anything, and opportunists emerge to exploit that desperation. Others respond with fatalism. If nothing helps, why bother with treatment at all? Just accept death when it comes. This fatalism will later manifest in the phenomenon of flagellant movements groups who wander from town to town whipping themselves in penance, believing the plague is divine punishment that cannot be avoided, only endured. The economic impact on medical practice is severe. The guild system that normally regulates physician training and practice breaks down. There aren't enough trained physicians to meet demand. Unlicensed practitioners, barber surgeons, herbalists, midwives begin treating plague patients despite lacking formal medical education. The guild authorities are in no position to enforce standards when half their membership is gone. Prices for medical services fluctuate wildly. Some physicians charge exorbitant fees, knowing desperate families will pay anything for hope. Others refuse payment, having given up on the idea that medicine can help. The market for medical services becomes deeply dysfunctional. Pharmacies run out of standard medications. The supply chains bringing exotic ingredients from the East have collapsed the same trade routes that brought the plague. Apothecaries improvise with local substitutes. The medications were ineffective anyway, but their absence adds to the general sense of systemic failure. The body disposal problem becomes overwhelming. In normal times, physicians would certify death, families would prepare bodies for burial, undertakers would manage funerals. In December 1347, the system cannot handle the volume. Bodies accumulate faster than they can be processed. The city employs mass gravediggers working in shifts around the clock. They excavate enormous pits, layer in corpses, add lime, repeat. The diggers themselves have high mortality rates. Exposure to infected fleas in the clothing and bedding of corpses ensures frequent transmission. You're a grave digger. Not by choice. You were a carpenter before the plague, but carpentry work has stopped. You need income. The city pays well for this job, well enough that you accept the risk. Your shift runs from dawn to dusk. You and 4 other men work one of the mass burial pits south of the city walls. You've been at this for 2 weeks. 3 of the original crew are gone, replaced by new workers who will likely be gone themselves within days. The corpse cart arrives every 2 hours. Sometimes it holds 12 bodies, sometimes 30. You stop seeing them as people you can't, or you'll go insane. They're just cargo, objects to be moved from cart to pit. You develop techniques. Grab the ankles, drag to the edge, roll into the pit. Don't look at the faces. Don't think about who they were. Don't notice the young ones, or the elderly, or the pregnant women. Just move the bodies. Mechanical, repetitive, mindless. The lime burns your hands. You should wear gloves, but they make the work harder, and gloves are expensive. Your hands develop chemical burns, then calluses. They crack and bleed. You wash them when you can, but water is for drinking first, washing second. The smell becomes your constant companion. It saturates your clothing, your hair, your skin. Your wife won't let you in the house until you've stripped and washed at the well. Your neighbors avoid you. You're associated with death, marked by it, contaminated by proximity. You notice a bubo on your inner thigh on December 20th. You're gone by December 22nd. The irony is not lost on you. 2 weeks of handling plague corpses, and a single flea bite ends you just like everyone else. The city replaces you the same day. There's always someone desperate enough to take the work. By late December, Messina's infrastructure is fundamentally broken. The government functions minimally. The economy has collapsed. The medical system is overwhelmed. The burial system is barely adequate. The population has been reduced by half, and the plague shows no signs of stopping. The physicians who remain alive are broken men. They've failed completely at their life's purpose. They've watched colleagues perish. They know they're probably next. Some continue working from a sense of duty. Others have simply given up, waiting for the inevitable. One physician, Bartolomeo of Messina, writes a letter to a colleague in Palermo, dated December 28th. We are powerless before this pestilence. Every remedy fails. Every patient succumbs. I fear this is the end of all things. God have mercy on us, for we are lost. Bartolomeo is gone by January 5th, 1348. His letter survives, preserved in archives, a testament to the complete helplessness of medieval medicine when confronted with a pathogen beyond its conceptual framework. These were real people, real physicians who dedicated their lives to healing. They tried. They failed, but they tried. They died attempting to save others. They deserve our remembrance, not our mockery. The medical system was inadequate, but the individuals within it acted with courage and compassion in the face of incomprehensible horror. The fire crackles lower. The darkness presses closer. December 1347 is ending. The new year will bring no relief. The plague is just beginning its journey across Europe. We're far from done, traveler. The nightmare deepens from here. Welcome to what happens when 40% of a city's population vanishes in 8 weeks, where every social structure simultaneously collapses, where the rules that govern civilization simply stop applying. December 1347 through January 1348 in Messina is a masterclass in how fast human society can disintegrate. Let's start with the family unit, the basic building block of medieval social organization. In normal times, families are multi-generational. Grandparents, parents, young ones, sometimes aunts and uncles, all under one roof. The elderly provide childcare and wisdom. The adults work and provide income. The young eventually care for aging parents. It's a complete economic and social system. The plague demolishes this structure. When you lose half your family members in a month, the system breaks. You're a 40-year-old artisan. Your parents are gone. Your spouse is gone. Your brother is gone. You have 2 surviving young ones, ages 9 and 12. You're suddenly a single parent with no support network, trying to work full-time while caring for traumatized youth in the middle of an ongoing apocalypse. The burden is impossible. You can't work and provide adequate supervision. You can't earn enough money if you stay home to care for them. Medieval society has no social services, no welfare system, no institutional support for suddenly orphaned families. What happens? Different families choose different survival strategies. Some older siblings, we're talking 12, 13, 14-year-olds, become heads of household by default. They're raising their younger siblings alone. These young people are managing finances, preparing food, making decisions about whether to flee or stay, dealing with grief and trauma, all while being fundamentally unprepared for adult responsibility. Other families fragment. The young ones are sent to relatives in other towns, if any relatives survive. Some are informally adopted by neighbors. Some end up in monasteries or convents. Religious institutions traditionally accept orphans, though by late December the monasteries themselves are devastated and can barely care for their own communities. The worst cases, young people left completely alone. Their entire family is gone. No relatives to take them in. No neighbors willing to accept additional mouths to feed when resources are scarce. These young people become street youth. They survive by begging, stealing, eating from abandoned food stores, sleeping in empty buildings. Messina, in January 1348, has hundreds of these orphaned youth. The city lacks infrastructure to help them. There's no orphanage system, no charitable organization with resources to intervene. The church attempts to organize relief, but the church itself is devastated. Half the priests are gone, monastery populations are decimated, and the surviving clergy are overwhelmed with burial rites and tending to the dying. You're a 12-year-old whose entire family succumbed in November. You're alone in your family's house, a 2-room structure near the market. For the first week after everyone was gone, you stayed inside, too frightened to leave, eating the remaining food stores. When the food ran out, you ventured into the streets. The city is transformed, empty buildings everywhere, doors hanging open where corpse collectors entered to remove bodies, personal possessions scattered in the streets, abandoned when families fled, left behind when people perished too quickly for organized packing. You're not the only young person alone. You encounter others, some your age, some younger, some older teenagers. You form informal groups for protection and resource sharing. You break into abandoned homes looking for food. You avoid adults when possible. Some are helpful. Some view orphaned youth as convenient unpaid labor or worse. The survival skills you develop are grim. You learn which buildings likely have food stores. You learn to recognize which corpses are recent enough that their clothing is worth taking. You learn to sleep lightly, to move quietly, to avoid notice. You're 12 years old and you've become a scavenger in a city of the dying. The economy has collapsed completely. In normal times, Messina's economy runs on trade, craft production, and agriculture from the surrounding countryside. Merchants import goods from across the Mediterranean and export Sicilian wheat, wine, and textiles. Artisans produce goods for local consumption and export. Farmers bring produce to city markets. All of this has stopped. The port is closed. Ships refuse to dock after the plague's origin became known. International trade has ceased. Craft production has halted. Too many artisans are gone. Too few customers remain. Too much social chaos to maintain normal business operations. The agricultural supply chain is broken. Farmers who survived the plague are keeping their produce for personal use rather than risking travel to a plague city. The result: Messina has plenty of money, but nothing to buy. Warehouses are full of goods, with no one to trade them. Shops are closed or abandoned. Markets don't function. The sophisticated commercial economy of a major Mediterranean port has reverted to subsistence-level survival. Currency becomes meaningless. You can't eat money. You can't trade it for food when there are no merchants operating. Gold and silver, normally the most valuable commodities, are suddenly worthless compared to actual food, clean water, or serviceable clothing. Barter systems emerge. People trade labor for food. Immune survivors trade their ability to work without fear of infection for shares of stored grain. Some enterprising individuals organize primitive supply distribution, gathering food from abandoned warehouses and distributing it in exchange for other goods or services. But there's no oversight, no regulation, no enforcement mechanism. The people controlling food distribution have enormous power. Some use it responsibly. Others exploit it, demanding excessive payment, favoring friends and family, withholding food from people they don't like. You're an immune survivor working as a corpse collector. The city pays you in bread rations 2 loaves per day, taken from city grain stores. This is the most reliable income source available. You're literally being paid in food to handle plague corpses. The bread is coarse, made from barely sieved flour that includes significant chaff and grain husks. In normal times, you'd consider it substandard. Now, it's luxury. You eat 1 loaf yourself and trade the other for whatever else you need: clothing, firewood, wine, vegetables when available. The trading network is entirely informal. You know a woman who has access to a warehouse of preserved fish. You trade her bread for fish. She trades fish to a man who controls a wine cellar. He trades wine for firewood. The firewood seller trades for bread. It's a circular economy running on trust and necessity. This system is fragile. It depends on people honoring agreements without legal enforcement. It depends on storage supplies lasting, and those supplies are finite. It depends on continued social cooperation, even as social norms collapse. And those norms are absolutely collapsing. The rules that govern medieval society: deference to authority, respect for property, adherence to religious codes, maintenance of public decorum, require stable conditions to function. when death is random and imminent, when authority figures are perishing alongside everyone else, when your neighbors might be gone tomorrow, the incentive to follow rules disappears. Crime increases dramatically. Empty homes are looted. Merchants who fled the city return to find their warehouses stripped bare. Personal property has no protection, the legal system isn't functioning, guards and officials are too overwhelmed or too gone to investigate theft. Violence increases. Disputes that would normally be resolved through legal or social mechanisms now escalate to physical confrontation. There's no effective law enforcement. The city guard is at perhaps 30% strength. The surviving guards are focused on essential functions, preventing complete chaos, protecting critical infrastructure, managing corpse disposal. They're not investigating common theft or assault. You witness a fight in the street in early January. Two men arguing over a cart full of grain. One claims he took it from an abandoned warehouse, salvage rights. In his view, the other claims the warehouse belongs to his family private property. The argument becomes shoving, then punching. Then one man draws a knife. In normal times, bystanders would intervene, city guards would respond, social pressure would de-escalate the situation. Now, everyone keeps walking. The guards are elsewhere. Social norms have eroded to the point where street violence provokes no response. The man with the knife wins the argument. He loads the grain onto his cart and leaves. The other man lies in the street, bleeding from a stomach wound. He'll probably be gone by evening. No one stops to help. Everyone has their own problems. Violence against women increases, though contemporary sources are typically vague about this medieval. Chroniclers don't document such things in detail. But we know from modern conflict zones that social breakdown correlates with increased violence against women. When legal systems collapse, when protective social structures disappear, when normal social sanctions stop functioning, vulnerable populations become more vulnerable. Women travel in groups when possible. They arm themselves with knives. They avoid being alone in isolated areas. The strategies women use in war zones are the strategies women use in plague-era Messina. The religious response evolves in disturbing directions. Some people intensify their faith, attending Mass daily, praying constantly, seeking comfort in religious ritual. Others abandon religion entirely. If God permits this horror, why worship God? A third group emerges, extremists who believe the plague is divine punishment and that extreme penance might appease divine wrath. These are the proto-flagellants groups who engage in public self-punishment. They parade through the streets, whipping themselves until they bleed, believing their suffering might atone for humanity's sins. The church hierarchy views this with suspicion it's theologically questionable and outside official church control. But the church lacks authority to stop it. Half the local clergy are gone. The survivors are overwhelmed. The flagellants fill a psychological need for people desperate to feel they're doing something, anything, to address the catastrophe. You watch a flagellant procession in mid-January. 30 men, stripped to the waist despite the winter cold, marching through the streets. They chant prayers in Latin. Every few steps, they lash their own backs with leather whips. Blood runs down their skin. Their backs are masses of welts and cuts. The crowd that watches is divided. Some join in the chanting, convinced this devotion might save the city. Others look on with horror at the spectacle. Still others are simply numb, just another instance of the surreal nightmare that daily life has become. The procession passes. Life continues. The plague continues. The flagellation changes nothing except to add self-inflicted suffering to the suffering already present. Municipal government barely functions. The city council has lost half its members. The survivors meet irregularly, attempting to address the crisis, but they're overwhelmed. The scope of the disaster exceeds their capacity to respond. They issue decrees, mandatory corpse removal, prohibition on looting, orders for citizens to fumigate their homes with aromatic smoke. The decrees are mostly ignored. There's no enforcement mechanism. The social contract between government and governed has fractured. The bureaucratic apparatus, tax collection, record-keeping, regulation enforcement has stopped. No one is paying taxes. There's no commerce to tax anyway. Record-keeping continues minimally. Someone is documenting mortality numbers, though the records are incomplete and probably undercount actual deaths. Regulation enforcement is non-existent. The city is operating in survival mode. Basic functions only: corpse disposal, minimal food distribution, keeping critical infrastructure operational. Everything else has stopped. Water supply is a critical concern. Messina draws water from wells and a few public fountains fed by aqueducts. Maintaining these systems requires labor, cleaning the wells, repairing the aqueducts, preventing contamination. The workforce to do this maintenance is depleted. Some wells become contaminated by corpse fluids seeping through soil, by people dumping waste too close to water sources, by simple lack of maintenance allowing biological contamination. The city posts warnings at contaminated wells, but not everyone can read, and desperate people drink from questionable sources when clean water isn't accessible. Sanitation is catastrophic. The normal system chamber pots emptied into designated waste pits. Streets cleaned periodically by municipal workers. Waste removed from the city has broken down. Waste accumulates in streets. The smell in residential areas becomes overpowering. This creates a vicious cycle. Poor sanitation attracts rats. Rats carry fleas. Fleas transmit plague. The very conditions created by social breakdown accelerate plague transmission. You're trying to maintain your household in early January. You've survived the plague, you had a bubo in November, recovered, and now have immunity. Your house is on a street where half the buildings are empty. Your neighbors on one side are gone. On the other side, a family of 3 survivors. You try to maintain cleanliness. You dump your waste in the designated pit at the end of the street, even though the pit is overflowing and creating a terrible smell. You sweep your floor daily. You change your bedding when possible, though clean straw is increasingly scarce, but your efforts are undermined by the surrounding neglect. The abandoned house next door has rats. Lots of rats. They're nesting in the old bedding, feeding on food left behind, and increasingly moving into your house looking for new food sources. You set traps. You get a cat. Cats are suddenly valuable. Their price in barter goods has increased tenfold. You block holes in your walls with rags and mud, but you're fighting a losing battle. The rat population is exploding, fed by abandoned food stores and lack of predation. The psychological toll on survivors is immense. Everyone is traumatized. Everyone has lost loved ones. Everyone has witnessed horrors, mass graves, plague victims and final agonies, corpses rotting in the streets, social breakdown and violence. There's no concept of mental health support, no therapy, no counseling, no framework for processing trauma. People cope however they can. Some cope through work, staying busy, focusing on practical tasks, avoiding time for reflection. Some cope through religion, prayer, ritual, community worship. Some cope through substance use, drinking wine until numbness sets in, using opium when available. Some don't cope at all. Contemporary sources vaguely reference people who took their own lives in despair. The numbers aren't documented, but the pattern is clear. Some survivors, overwhelmed by loss and horror, choose to end their suffering. The winter weather adds another layer of misery. December and January in Sicily are mild by Northern European standards, but still cold enough to require heating. Firewood supplies are strained, normal woodcutting and distribution systems have collapsed. People burn furniture, building materials, whatever combustible material they can find. Some abandoned buildings are stripped bare doors, window frames, roof beams, all taken for firewood. The buildings become uninhabitable shells, further degrading the urban landscape. Food supplies are paradoxically adequate but poorly distributed. The city's warehouses contain grain, wine, preserved fish, and olive oil, enough to feed the surviving population for months. But the distribution mechanisms have failed. Some people have access to these stores, others don't. The result is simultaneous abundance and scarcity. You hear stories of people starving in one district while grain rots unused in warehouses in another district. The organizational capacity to efficiently distribute resources has vanished. By late January, Messina has reached a kind of terrible equilibrium. The exponential growth phase of the plague has ended not because of successful intervention, but because the pool of susceptible individuals has shrunk. New cases still occur, but at a slower rate. The daily death toll has dropped from hundreds to dozens. This is not recovery. This is simply the mathematics of epidemic spread. The city has been devastated. The social structures that made it a functioning urban center have collapsed. The survivors exist in a state of traumatized subsistence. These were real people living through incomprehensible catastrophe. They were trying to maintain their humanity, to help each other, to preserve some semblance of civilization while everything collapsed around them. Some succeeded. Some failed. All of them suffered. They deserve our remembrance and our respect for enduring what we cannot imagine. The fire burns low. The shadows lengthen. January 1348 is ending. The plague in Messina is entering its final phase. But across the Mediterranean, in dozens of other ports, the same nightmare is just beginning. We're not even halfway through this journey, traveler. The scope keeps expanding. Welcome to the nightmare going viral, where 12 ships from one port become the delivery system for Continental apocalypse, where Patient Zero in Messina becomes Patient Zero in 50 cities simultaneously. Let's talk about what happened when those Genoese galleys got turned away from Messina in October 1347, because they didn't just disappear, they went somewhere else, multiple somewhere elses. The captain of a plague ship faces an impossible situation. You've got dying crew members, you've got a cargo hold full of valuable goods that you're contractually obligated to deliver. You've got investors back in Genoa who will financially ruin you if you dump the cargo and return empty. You need to dock somewhere. Messina says no. Fine. You sail to the next port, Syracuse, 40 miles south. Maybe they haven't heard about the plague yet. Maybe they'll let you dock long enough to offload cargo and take on supplies. Syracuse has heard. They refuse entry. You sail north to Catania. Refused. You try smaller ports along the Sicilian coast. Refused. 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 Your crew is dying. You're running low on water. The rats in your hold are abandoning ship every time you get close to shore, swimming to land and carrying their plague-infected fleas with them. You're a mobile epidemiological weapon spreading contamination along the entire Sicilian coastline. By late October, you're desperate enough to try anywhere. You sail north to Naples. It's a major port, harder to refuse a Genoese merchant vessel. You arrive. The harbor master comes out to inspect. He sees the sick crew. He orders you to stay in the harbor, quarantined. You're anchored offshore for a week. During that week, rats continue leaving your ship, swimming to shore, entering the Naples waterfront district, establishing residence in warehouses and homes, leaving their fleas behind. The fleas find human hosts. Naples experiences its first plague case in early November. By December, the city is experiencing the same catastrophe as Messina. By January, Naples has lost 30% of its population. Congratulations, Captain. You've just killed 30,000 people by trying to deliver a shipment of silk. This pattern repeats at every port the plague ships visit. Some ports allow limited docking. Others refuse but can't prevent rats from swimming ashore. Others unknowingly accept contaminated cargo that was offloaded at an intermediate port and reshipped. The Mediterranean trade network, which normally distributes goods efficiently across the region, becomes a distribution network for plague. Every trade route becomes a transmission vector. Every port becomes a new outbreak epicenter. By December 1347, plague has arrived in Marseille, Genoa, Venice, Tunis, Alexandria, and Constantinople. By January 1348, it's in Barcelona, Pisa, Florence, and Dubrovnik. The initial single-city outbreak has metastasized into a regional pandemic. The speed is staggering. In normal times, news travels slowly. A letter from Messina to Paris might take 6 weeks. Information about the plague's severity lags behind the plague's actual spread. Cities hear vague rumors of disease in Sicily. Then cases appear in their own streets before they can implement preventive measures. Even when cities receive clear warnings, they struggle with the economic implications of closing ports. You're a city council member in Genoa in November 1347. You receive a letter from a colleague in Messina describing the catastrophe. He strongly recommends closing your port to all traffic from the eastern Mediterranean. But Genoa's economy depends on trade. Closing the port means no imports, no exports, massive economic disruption, unemployment, possible social unrest. And maybe the plague won't actually reach Genoa. Maybe Messina's experience was unique. Maybe the disease won't spread. You debate. You hesitate. You implement half measures inspecting incoming ships, quarantining obviously sick sailors, requiring fumigation of cargo. You convince yourself you're being cautious while keeping commerce flowing. It's not enough. The plague arrives anyway. It's in your city before you realize, spreading through the population before you can react. By the time you understand the severity, implementing a port closure is pointless. The disease is already established in your local population. Genoa experiences explosive outbreak in December 1347. The city that was home to the merchants who inadvertently brought plague from the Black Sea becomes one of the disease's major victims. The irony is not lost on contemporary chroniclers. Venice implements stricter measures. In March 1348, the Venetian government establishes one of history's first formal quarantine systems. Ships arriving from infected areas must anchor offshore for 40 days before crew and cargo can enter the city. This is the origin of the word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. Does it work? Partially. Venice's outbreak is delayed and somewhat less severe than other Italian cities, but the plague still gets in through land routes, through incomplete enforcement, through asymptomatic carriers who pass inspection. You can slow the plague's spread, but medieval technology and medical knowledge make stopping it completely nearly impossible. The land routes are the real problem. You can control your port, but you can't control your roads. Merchants travel overland carrying contaminated goods. Refugees flee plague cities, carrying infections with them. Rats infest carts and wagons, traveling inland away from coastal outbreak zones. The plague spreads north from Italian ports into the Alpine regions, then over the mountains into France and the Holy Roman Empire. It spreads west from Barcelona into central Spain. It spreads east from Constantinople into the Balkans and towards Russia. Each new city experiences the same progression: initial cases, exponential growth, social breakdown, mass mortality, eventual burnout. The timeline varies. Some cities experience compressed outbreaks over 6 weeks. Others endure prolonged epidemics lasting 6 months, but the pattern remains consistent. You're a merchant in Avignon, France, in March 1348. You've heard rumors about a terrible plague in Italy, but Avignon is the seat of the papacy. Surely God will protect his holiest city. You continue normal business operations. You buy wool from Florentine traders. You sell wine to Genoese merchants. Life continues normally. The wool you purchased in early March was packed in Florence in February by workers who were incubating plague but not yet symptomatic. The fabric carried infected fleas. You stored the wool in your warehouse. The fleas emerged, seeking new hosts, finding the rats who live in your warehouse. The rats became infected. Their fleas bit you and your workers. By late March, you're experiencing the now familiar symptoms: fever, buboes, rapid deterioration. You're gone by early April. Your workers spread the infection to their families. Their families spread it through the community. Avignon's outbreak begins. The papal court is horrified. Pope Clement VI is in residence. The church's administrative center is threatened. The Pope's physicians recommend isolation. The Pope should minimize contact with potentially infected individuals, stay in his chambers, have minimal staff. Pope Clement refuses. He's the spiritual leader of Catholic Christendom. His people are dying. He needs to be visible, active, providing comfort and leadership. He holds audiences. He blesses the sick. He presides over mass funerals. The Pope's personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, one of the era's most accomplished medical minds, desperately tries to protect his patient. He develops a protocol. The Pope sits between 2 large fires during audiences, believing the heat will purify the air. Visitors are kept at a distance. The Pope's chambers are fumigated constantly with aromatic herbs. It actually works. Pope Clement survives the plague. Whether due to the fire protocol, pure luck, or natural immunity, he doesn't contract the disease. But tens of thousands of Avignon residents aren't so fortunate. The city experiences mortality rates similar to other outbreak zones, 40 to 50% of the population gone by summer, 1348. The psychological impact of the plague reaching Avignon is enormous. If the Pope's city isn't safe, nowhere is safe. If being the center of Christendom doesn't provide divine protection, maybe there is no divine protection. The theological implications are devastating. Some interpret the plague as God's judgment on church corruption. The church has become too wealthy, too worldly, too removed from Christ's teachings. The plague is divine punishment, a call to reform. This interpretation will fuel reform movements for centuries. Others abandon faith entirely. If God permits this horror, if prayer doesn't stop it, if the righteous die alongside the wicked, maybe God doesn't exist or doesn't care. This is spiritually dangerous thinking in the medieval worldview, but the plague creates conditions where such thoughts can emerge. The flagellant movements intensify. These groups of lay people travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in penance. They believe their suffering might appease divine wrath, might convince God to end the plague. The movement starts in German lands, but spreads rapidly across Europe. The church hierarchy views flagellants with increasing alarm. These are unsanctioned religious activities happening outside church control. Some flagellant groups develop heretical beliefs that their penance is more effective than church sacraments, that the church itself is corrupt and unnecessary. The movement threatens church authority at a time when that authority is already strained by the plague's horrors. By 1349, the Church officially condemns flagellant movements. Pope Clement issues a papal bull declaring them heretical. The Inquisition pursues flagellant leaders. But suppressing the movements is difficult when half the enforcement apparatus, local clergy, civic authorities, Inquisition personnel is gone or overwhelmed by plague response. The plague spread into northern Europe follows trade routes. Hanseatic League ships carry it from Flanders to England in June 1348. London experiences outbreak by August. By winter 1348, Scotland and Ireland are affected. By 1349, Scandinavia and Eastern Europe are experiencing outbreaks. England's experience is particularly well documented. The chronicler Henry Knighton describes London in autumn 1348. The mortality was so great that the living could scarcely bury the deceased. A plot of ground in Smithfield was consecrated for mass burials. More than 200 corpses were buried there daily. 200 per day in London alone, for months. The arithmetic is horrifying. The city's population drops from perhaps 80,000 to 50,000, 30,000 gone. And London is just one city among hundreds experiencing similar catastrophes. The rural areas initially seem safer. Villages are isolated, populations are dispersed, contact with urban plague zones is limited. Maybe the countryside will escape the worst. Wrong. The plague reaches rural areas through multiple vectors. Fleeing urbanites carry it to country estates. Traveling merchants spread it along rural trade routes. Rats and fleas infest grain shipments from cities to countryside. Rural outbreaks are often more devastating than urban ones. Villages lack physicians, most doctors practice in cities. Rural populations have less access to food stores, they depend on current harvest. And if the plague hits during planting or harvest season, the entire year's food production is disrupted. You're a peasant farmer in rural England in summer 1348. Your village has 60 residents. You've heard about plague in London, but London is 80 miles away. You feel reasonably safe. A merchant passes through in June, selling goods from town to town. He stays overnight at the village inn. He seems healthy. He leaves the next morning, continuing his route. 3 days later, the innkeeper's wife develops fever, then the innkeeper, then guests who stayed at the inn, then family members of those guests. The exponential progression begins. Your village has no physician. The nearest doctor is 15 miles away in the market town, and he's not making house calls to plague villages. You treat the sick with folk remedies, herbal teas, prayers, poultices. Nothing works. By July, 40 of 60 villagers are gone. The survivors include you, a handful of family groups, and some young people who inherited their parents' farms. 20 farms suddenly have no one to work them. 20 households' worth of property has no clear ownership. The economic and social implications are staggering. The feudal system depends on stable populations of peasant farmers working the land. When 2/3 of the farming population disappears, the system breaks down. Who will harvest the crops? Who will plant next year's fields? Who owns the abandoned land? The survivors are suddenly valuable, their labor is scarce, they can demand better conditions from landlords who need workers. This creates the conditions for massive social change. Before the plague, peasant farmers have minimal bargaining power. Labor is abundant, land is scarce. Landlords set terms. After the plague, labor is scarce, land is abundant. The power balance shifts, but that's looking ahead. In 1348 and 1349, the immediate concern is survival. The social revolution will come later. Right now, it's just horror, mortality, and desperate attempts to maintain basic agricultural production. The plague spreads across North Africa through coastal trade routes. Alexandria, Cairo, Tunis, and other Mediterranean ports experience outbreaks. The mortality patterns mirror European cities' 40 to 60% population loss in major urban centers. The Islamic world's medical response is similar to Christian Europe's physicians trained in Galenic medicine, reliance on humoral theory, treatments that don't work, high mortality among medical practitioners. The disease doesn't discriminate by religion or culture. Everyone is equally vulnerable. Some Islamic physicians make astute observations. Ibn al-Khatib, writing in Granada, correctly identifies that plague spreads through contact. The existence of contagion is established by experience, investigation, the evidence of the senses, and trustworthy reports. He recommends isolation and avoiding contact with infected individuals. But like European physicians who recognize contagion, he doesn't understand the mechanism. He thinks it spreads through corrupted air transferred from person to person, not through flea vectors. His recommendations are: partially effective isolation reduces spread, but not because of the reasoning he provides. By 1349, the Black Death has spread across the known world, from China through Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. The connected trade networks that brought prosperity also brought catastrophe. The total death toll will never be known precisely. Medieval census data is incomplete. Many areas kept no records. Estimates range from 75 million to 200 million dead across Eurasia and North Africa. Europe alone loses between 30 and 60% of its population. This is what happens when patient zero in Messina in October 1347 becomes patient zero everywhere by 1349. The single outbreak becomes the global pandemic. The local catastrophe becomes civilizational transformation. These millions of dead were real people, real families destroyed, real communities devastated. They lived through horrors we can barely imagine. They watched their worlds collapse. Many died trying to help others: physicians, priests, caregivers, civic officials. They deserve our remembrance for their courage in the face of incomprehensible suffering. The fire flickers, the night deepens. We're past the halfway point of this journey, traveler. The plague spread is documented. Now we need to examine its long-term consequences. The nightmare isn't over. It's transforming into something new. Welcome to what happens when people need someone to blame for apocalyptic horror, where fear and grief transform into rage, where entire communities get annihilated because humans need explanations, even false ones. Let's talk about the Jews of medieval Europe in 1348 and 1349. And let's be clear from the start. What happens to them is one of history's great injustices, a catastrophe built on lies, fueled by hate, and enabled by social breakdown. The plague spreads through Europe with no one understanding the actual mechanism. Medieval people can see that it's contagious. Sick people make others sick, but they don't understand how. The miasma theory, corrupted air, doesn't fully explain the patterns. Why does it spread so fast in some places, slower in others? Why do some people survive? Why does it seem random? Humans hate randomness. We're pattern-seeking creatures. We need causes, explanations, someone or something to blame. When natural explanations fail, supernatural or conspiratorial explanations emerge. The first conspiracy theory: the Jews are poisoning the wells. This is completely false. There is zero evidence for it. It makes no logical sense. Jewish communities are dying from plague at the same rates as Christian communities. Why would they poison their own water supply? But logic doesn't matter when people are terrified and grieving and desperate for someone to blame. The accusation emerges in southern France and German lands in early 1348. The specific claim: Jews are adding poison to public wells and fountains, deliberately spreading the plague as part of a plot to destroy Christendom. Some versions claim Jews are acting on orders from rabbis. Other versions claim they're working with Muslims, another hated-out group in a combined conspiracy. Some versions include elaborate details about the poison's composition, recipes allegedly found in confiscated documents. It's all fabricated. The confessions are extracted through torture. The evidence is manufactured. The documents are forgeries. But in the climate of plague-induced hysteria, none of this matters. You're a Christian resident of Strasbourg in February 1349. The plague has been ravaging the city for months. You've lost family members. Everyone you know has lost someone. The mass graves keep filling. Nothing helps. The physicians can't cure it. The priests can't stop it. God seems absent. Then you hear the rumor. The Jews did this. They poisoned the wells. They're murdering Christians deliberately. Your grief and fear suddenly have a target. The randomness of plague becomes a malicious conspiracy. The senseless horror becomes intentional evil. And there's something you can do about it. The violence begins in isolated incidents but rapidly escalates to coordinated massacres. Jewish communities in Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, Basel, and dozens of other cities face organized attacks. Christian mobs, sometimes led by local authorities, sometimes acting against official orders, storm Jewish quarters. The pattern is horrifyingly consistent. The mob surrounds the Jewish quarter, sets buildings on fire, kills anyone trying to escape. Entire communities, hundreds or thousands of people perish in single incidents. Some cities see their entire Jewish populations annihilated within hours. Strasbourg in February 1349. Approximately 2,000 Jewish residents are rounded up, forced into a wooden building, and the building is set on fire. Those who try to escape are killed. The entire community is gone in one day. Their property is confiscated and distributed among Christian residents. Mainz in August 1349. 3,000 Jewish residents. Similar patterns surrounded, burned, killed. The few survivors are forcibly converted to Christianity or expelled. This happens in city after city across German lands, France, Spain, and parts of Italy. Estimated total, somewhere between 200 and 500 Jewish communities destroyed. Death toll estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000. Pope Clement VI issues papal bulls condemning the violence. He correctly points out that Jews are dying from plague at the same rates as Christians. If they were the cause, why would they be dying? He threatens excommunication for anyone attacking Jewish communities. It doesn't stop the violence. The papal authority that might normally enforce such decrees has been weakened by the plague. Local clergy are gone or overwhelmed. The Inquisition, which might investigate and punish, lacks resources. And many local Christian populations don't care what the Pope says. They want someone to blame. And Jews are a convenient target. Some secular authorities try to protect Jewish communities. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV issues orders protecting Jews and condemning the accusations as false. Some city councils refuse to allow anti-Jewish violence, recognizing it as unjust. But many authorities either participate in the violence or allow it to happen. Some see it as politically expedient. Jewish communities often served as moneylenders, one of the few professions open to them under medieval law, and killing them meant debts could be forgiven. Some authorities genuinely believe the conspiracy theories. Others simply lack the power to stop armed mobs during a period of social breakdown. The economic motivations are significant. Medieval Jews, barred from many professions by Christian restrictions, often worked as moneylenders or merchants. Christians owed them debts. Killing the creditors meant the debts disappeared. Property seizures enriched both mob participants and local governments. This is an anti-Semitic pogrom wrapped in plague conspiracy theories, but the economic incentives are a major driver. The plague provides justification for violence that has underlying financial motivations. You're a Jewish resident of a small German town in summer 1349. Your community numbers perhaps 50 families. You've lived here for generations. You know your Christian neighbors, you've traded with them, worked alongside them, attended civic events together. Relations have been mostly peaceful. Then the plague arrives. Within weeks, a quarter of the town is gone. The Christian priest, desperate to explain the catastrophe, endorses the well-poisoning theory in a sermon. Your neighbors' attitudes shift overnight. People who traded with you yesterday avoid you today. You hear the whispers. The Jews did this. They're murdering us. The town council meets. They debate whether to expel the Jewish community or allow violence against them. Some council members argue for protection. These are fellow residents. The accusations are baseless. Others argue for expulsion as a safety measure, even if the accusations are false, to prevent mob violence. The decision: forced expulsion. You have 3 days to leave. You can take portable possessions, your house, your shop, your land, all confiscated. You're suddenly a refugee with whatever you can carry. Where do you go? Other towns won't accept you. They have the same fears and hatreds. You head toward Poland, where King Casimir III has issued protection for Jewish refugees, offering settlement rights and religious tolerance. Poland becomes a refuge for thousands fleeing Western European persecution. The journey is dangerous. You travel in groups for protection. You face bandits, exposure, hunger, hostile populations in every region you pass through. Many don't survive the journey. Those who reach Poland alive have lost everything except their lives. This mass migration shifts European Jewish population concentrations from west to east. Communities that existed in German lands for centuries are destroyed. The survivors rebuild in Poland, Lithuania, and Eastern Europe. This demographic shift will have consequences for centuries. The psychological trauma on surviving Jewish communities is immense. The betrayal by neighbors who turned to violence. The randomness of which communities were attacked and which were spared. The loss of entire family networks, cultural centers, centuries of accumulated community history. And all of it based on a lie. The wells weren't poisoned. The plague spread through natural mechanisms, rats, fleas, bacterial transmission. The conspiracy theory was false from the beginning. But the violence it unleashed was devastatingly real. The Christian communities that perpetrated these massacres also suffered consequences. They committed mass murder based on false accusations. Many individuals participated directly in killings. The moral weight of this, the recognition, for some, that they killed innocent people creates its own trauma. Some perpetrators rationalize. We were protecting our families. We believed the accusations. We were following orders. Others experience genuine remorse, but lack any framework for accountability or restitution. There's no justice system capable of addressing crimes of this scale. The economic consequences for Christian communities that expelled or killed their Jewish populations are significant. They lose an educated, skilled segment of their population. They lose money lending services, which many Christian communities depended on for credit. Some towns experience economic decline for generations after destroying their Jewish communities. But in the immediate crisis of 1348 and 1349, few people are thinking about long-term economic consequences. They're thinking about survival, about blame, about directing their fear and rage at a target. Other groups face scapegoating as well, though at lesser scale than Jewish communities. Lepers are accused of spreading plague, the logic being that they already have a disease. Maybe they're spreading this one too. Some leper colonies are attacked. Beggars and travelers face suspicion, outsiders who might be carrying plague. Flagellant groups, initially seen as pious, become suspected of spreading plague through their travels. The fundamental psychology is consistent. When faced with incomprehensible catastrophe, humans seek explanations and targets for blame. The actual cause, Yersinia pestis transmitted through flea vectors, is invisible and incomprehensible to medieval people. The false cause, malicious poisoning by hated outgroups, is visible, comprehensible, and actionable. This pattern will repeat throughout history. Disease outbreaks frequently trigger scapegoating of minority groups. The accusations vary: spreading disease deliberately, being inherently unclean, divine punishment for tolerating their presence, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. The Black Death scapegoating legacy is particularly severe because of the scale. This isn't isolated incidents, it's coordinated violence across an entire continent over multiple years. The destruction of Jewish communities in German lands represents one of medieval Europe's worst atrocities. And it happens while everyone involved is also dealing with plague. The perpetrators are grief-stricken and terrified. The victims are dying from plague at the same rates as their attackers. The authorities who might intervene are overwhelmed or gone. The social mechanisms that might prevent such violence have collapsed. This doesn't excuse the violence. Understanding the context doesn't diminish the injustice. These were pogroms, organized massacres of innocent people based on false accusations. The perpetrators made choices. The authorities who allowed it made choices. The choice to commit violence, to seize property, to kill neighbors, these were human decisions, not inevitable outcomes. The survivors carry this trauma for generations. Jewish communities that rebuilt in Eastern Europe maintained collective memory of the 1348 massacres. The stories were passed down, remembered, mourned. The destruction of communities, the burning of synagogues, the loss of family lines, all documented, remembered, integrated into collective historical consciousness. The Christian communities developed their own memory, often sanitized. The violence gets reframed as justifiable response to perceived threats, or conveniently forgotten, or blamed on mob excess rather than acknowledged as systematic persecution. The economic benefits seized property, canceled debts are enjoyed by descendants who prefer not to examine their origins too closely. By 1350, the worst of the plague-related anti-Jewish violence has ended. Not because attitudes changed, but because most Jewish communities in affected areas are already destroyed or expelled. The remaining communities are those that were successfully protected or those in regions where the conspiracy theories didn't gain traction. The long-term consequences reshape European demographics and culture. The Jewish population shift eastward. The theological questions about why God permitted such suffering. The legal and social frameworks that allowed the violence. All of this reverberates for centuries. These were real people, both the Jewish victims and the Christian perpetrators. The victims deserve remembrance for enduring injustice on top of plague. The perpetrators' actions deserve recognition as a moral catastrophe, a failure of humanity during crisis. We learn from horror by acknowledging it honestly, not by sanitizing or excusing it. The fire burns lower, the night is cold. We've examined the plague spread, its immediate impact, its triggering of the worst human impulses. Now we need to look at what comes after. How do you rebuild from apocalyptic destruction? The journey continues, traveler. The darkest parts are documented. Now comes the long, painful aftermath. Welcome to Europe in 1350, where the plague has finally burned itself out, where half the population is gone, where survivors are trying to rebuild civilization from the ashes. Spoiler alert, it's absolutely cooked. Let's talk about what happens when you lose 30 to 60% of your population in 3 years. The labor shortage alone is catastrophic. Every profession, every industry, every economic sector is suddenly operating at a fraction of capacity. Agriculture is hit hardest. Medieval farming is labor-intensive. You need people to plow fields, plant crops, tend livestock, harvest grain, process food. A typical manor employs dozens of laborers. When half of them are gone, you can't maintain the same level of production. The 1350 harvest across Europe is a disaster. Not because of weather or blight, the growing conditions are fine. The disaster is insufficient labor. Fields go unplowed. Crops go unplanted. Livestock wanders unattended. The harvest that does happen is a fraction of normal yields. You're a surviving peasant farmer in England in spring 1350. Your village had 60 residents before the plague. 20 remain. Your community needs to plant enough crops to feed 20 people. That should be easy. You have 3 times as much land per person as before. Except it doesn't work that way. You can't personally farm 3 times as much land. You don't have the time or the physical capacity. The oxen that pull plows are in short supply. Many owners died. The animals wandered off or were slaughtered for food. The tools you need are scarce. The blacksmith who made them is gone. You plant what you can. Maybe half your pre-plague acreage. The other half lies fallow. It's not enough to produce surplus for trade, but it's enough to feed your immediate family. That's the new calculation. Subsistence farming, not commercial agriculture. This pattern repeats across Europe. Total agricultural output crashes, but so has the population. The math is weird. You have half as much food being produced, but you also have half as many people to feed. In theory, supply and demand balance. In practice, it's more complicated. Food distribution systems have collapsed. The merchant networks that moved grain from surplus regions to deficit regions aren't functioning. Some areas have food rotting in storage, while other areas face shortage. The organizational capacity to efficiently distribute resources is gone. The labor shortage creates a weird economic phenomenon. Workers suddenly have bargaining power. Before the plague, labor was cheap and abundant. Landlords set wages. Workers accepted whatever was offered or faced unemployment and starvation. After the plague, workers are scarce and valuable. You're a surviving laborer. Multiple landlords need your labor. You can demand higher wages. You can negotiate better conditions. If one landlord refuses, you can work for another. This is revolutionary. The feudal system depends on workers having no leverage. When workers gain bargaining power, the entire social structure is threatened. Landlords and governments respond with wage and price controls. England passes the Statute of Laborers in 1351. Wages are frozen at pre-plague levels. Workers cannot demand higher pay. Employers cannot offer higher pay. Anyone violating this faces prosecution. The law is widely ignored. You can pass all the legislation you want, but if employers need workers and workers can demand higher pay, market forces trump legal restrictions. Landlords secretly pay above the mandated wages. Workers move to employers offering better conditions. The enforcement mechanism is weak anyway. The legal system is operating at reduced capacity. Judges and court officials died in the plague. The surviving judiciary is overwhelmed. Prosecuting wage violations is low priority when the entire social order is unstable. The Black Death creates conditions for massive social mobility. Before the plague, social class is mostly fixed. Peasants remain peasants. Artisans remain artisans. Mobility between classes is rare and difficult. After the plague, the empty positions create opportunities. You're a young person from a peasant family. Normally, you'd expect to farm for life. But the local miller died without heirs. The position is vacant. You can learn milling and take over the business. Suddenly, you're a skilled tradesman instead of a peasant farmer. This happens across professions. The blacksmith dies. His apprentice becomes the new blacksmith. The merchant dies. His clerk becomes the new merchant. Entire families move up the economic ladder by filling positions left vacant by plague mortality. The guild system tries to resist this. Guilds control access to skilled trades through apprenticeship requirements and membership restrictions. Becoming a master craftsman normally requires years of training and guild approval. But when half the guild members are gone, the guilds lack capacity to maintain strict standards. They're forced to accept less trained members or risk their trades collapsing entirely. Quality control suffers, but the guilds survive by lowering barriers to entry. The church faces its own crisis. Parishes lost their priests. Monasteries lost their monks. The institutional church is devastated. Remaining clergy are overwhelmed, conducting funeral masses for plague victims, providing last rites, maintaining basic religious services. The church responds by rapidly ordaining new priests. The normal training period, years of theological education, is shortened. Men with minimal preparation are ordained to fill vacant positions. The quality of clergy declines. Some new priests barely understand Latin, the language of the Mass. This creates long-term problems. The late medieval church will face credibility issues partly stemming from the reduced educational standards necessitated by plague losses. The poorly trained clergy of the 1350s contribute to the institutional problems that will fuel the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. Economic dislocation is severe. Trade networks are disrupted. The Hanseatic League, which dominated Northern European trade, experiences massive disruption. Ships, merchants, warehouses, trading posts all operating at reduced capacity. The luxury goods trade particularly suffers. Silk, spices, precious metals, exotic fabrics, these depend on long-distance trade networks and wealthy customers. When the trade routes are disrupted and half the wealthy customers are gone, demand collapses. Some industries actually benefit. The funeral industry, obviously. Grave diggers, undertakers, clergy performing burial rites, their services are in high demand. They become relatively wealthy through the catastrophe. The medical profession faces a reckoning. Physicians failed spectacularly during the plague. Their treatments didn't work. Many died alongside their patients. The survivors face a credibility crisis. Why trust physicians when they couldn't stop the plague? Some physicians abandon humoral theory, recognizing its inadequacy. They begin experimenting with new approaches, though without understanding germ theory, they can't develop truly effective treatments. Others double down on traditional methods, insisting the plague was a special case and standard medicine remains valid for other conditions. Medical education shifts slightly. Universities begin emphasizing observation and experience over pure textual authority. The plague demonstrated that Galen and Hippocrates didn't have all the answers. Maybe direct observation of patients and diseases could supplement classical texts. This is a small step toward empirical medicine, though the full scientific revolution is still centuries away. The plague creates an opening for questioning authority and seeking new knowledge. The psychological impact on survivors is profound and long-lasting. Everyone alive in 1350 has experienced trauma. They've watched loved ones die. They've seen mass graves. They've experienced social breakdown. They've survived apocalyptic catastrophe. There's no framework for addressing collective trauma on this scale. No therapy, no support groups, no mental health services. People cope however they can. Some cope through hedonism. They survive death, they're going to enjoy life while they can. Increased drinking, gambling, promiscuity. A live for today mentality when tomorrow might bring another plague. Contemporary moralists complain about declining moral standards in post-plague society. People are less religious, less respectful of authority, more focused on pleasure than duty. The complaints reflect real social changes driven by the trauma and social dislocation of plague years. Others cope through increased religiosity. They survive through God's grace. They owe their lives to divine mercy. They become more devout, more generous to the church, more focused on salvation and the afterlife. The dance of death dance macabre becomes a popular artistic motif. Images of skeletons dancing with the living, leading them to their graves. Rich and poor, young and old, all equal before death. It's a meditation on mortality and the randomness of death, directly inspired by plague experiences. The survivor guilt is intense. Why did I survive when my family didn't? What makes me special? Some survivors interpret their survival as divine favor. God spared them for a purpose. Others see it as random luck and struggle to find meaning in their survival. You're a survivor in 1351, 3 years after losing your spouse and 2 of your 3 young ones to plague. You've rebuilt a life. You've remarried. There are many widows and widowers seeking new partnerships. You've taken over a business left vacant by plague deaths. You're materially better off than before the plague, but the grief never fully leaves. You think about your lost loved ones constantly. You wonder why you survived. You feel guilty for being happy in your new life. You experience what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD, intrusive memories, emotional numbness, hypervigilance about illness. The young people who survived childhood plague have their own trauma. They grew up surrounded by death. Many lost parents, became orphans, experienced extreme disruption. This generation will carry the psychological scars for life. Property ownership becomes chaotic. When someone dies without clear heirs, their property should revert to the feudal lord. But when entire families die simultaneously, determining inheritance becomes complex. Distant relatives claim property. Neighbors occupy abandoned buildings. Lords claim everything, sparking disputes. The legal system is overwhelmed with property cases. Courts in the 1350s spend enormous time adjudicating plague-related property disputes. Who owns this farm? Who inherits this shop? Who has rights to this land? The uncertainty creates opportunities for fraud, forged inheritance documents, false claims of relationship to the deceased, people claiming property they have no legitimate right to. The overwhelmed courts struggle to separate valid claims from fabricated ones. Women gain some increased independence in post-plague society. The labor shortage means women's labor becomes more valuable. Widows inherit businesses and property. Some run workshops, manage estates, engage in trade activities normally restricted to men. This doesn't mean equality medieval society remains deeply patriarchal, but the crack in the system created by labor shortage and property redistribution gives some women opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Urban areas face particular challenges. Cities were hit hardest by plague. The density that made them economic powerhouses also made them plague death traps. Rebuilding urban populations requires immigration from rural areas. Cities offer incentives, reduced taxes, relaxed citizenship requirements, opportunities for advancement. Rural peasants migrate to cities, seeking better economic prospects. This repopulates urban areas but drains rural populations further. The geographic distribution of population shifts. Some regions were hit harder than others. Areas with high plague mortality experience depopulation and economic decline. Areas less affected see relative population and economic growth. Abandoned villages appear across Europe. Entire communities dead or dispersed, buildings left to decay, fields reverting to wilderness. These deserted medieval villages remain archaeological sites today, silent testament to the plague's demographic impact. Technology begins advancing in small ways. Labor shortage creates incentive for labor-saving devices. Watermills and windmills become more common. Mechanical innovations that reduce human labor requirements gain adoption. This is a very gradual process. There's no immediate industrial revolution. But the plague plants seeds for technological development by making labor-saving innovation economically attractive. The art and literature of the post-plague period reflects the trauma. Themes of death, mortality, the fragility of life dominate. The ars moriendi art of dying becomes a literary genre, guides for how to die well and prepare for death. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in 1353, frames its stories with characters fleeing plague in Florence. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written later in the century, includes plague references. The plague permeates cultural production for generations. The economic recovery is slow and uneven. Some regions bounce back within a generation. Others take a century to return to pre-plague population levels. The economic structures that emerge are different from before: higher wages, more social mobility, increased urbanization. By 1360, Europe has stabilized into a new normal. The plague hasn't disappeared. It will return in waves for centuries, but the catastrophic mortality of 1347 through 1350 has ended. Society has adapted to the new demographic reality. The world that emerges is transformed. The feudal system is weakened. The church's authority is questioned. Social mobility has increased. Labor has value. The absolute certainties of the pre-plague world have been shattered. These changes, born from catastrophe, set the stage for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the eventual emergence of modern Europe. The Black Death is a historical hinge point. The world before is fundamentally different from the world after. The survivors carried scars, but they rebuilt. They created new families, new communities, new social structures from the ruins of the old. They demonstrated human resilience in the face of incomprehensible loss. Their suffering deserves our acknowledgement. Their resilience deserves our admiration. They endured what we can barely imagine and found ways to keep living, to rebuild, to hope. The fire has burned low. The night is nearly over. We're approaching the end of this journey through Patient Zero and the catastrophe that followed. One more section, traveler. The final reckoning and what we've learned from their suffering. Welcome to the end of our journey through Patient Zero and the Black Death, where we take stock of what happened, what it means, and what we've learned from 75 to 200 million deaths. Let's start with the numbers, because the scale matters. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa, in 3 years. To put that in perspective, World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, killed approximately 75 million people over 6 years. The Black Death matched or exceeded that toll in half the time, with a much smaller global population. The demographic recovery took centuries. Some regions didn't return to pre-plague population levels until the 1500s, over 150 years later. England's population in 1346 was approximately 6 million. In 1400, it was 2.5 million. It didn't return to 6 million until the late 1500s. That's 150 years of depopulation. Multiple generations living in a world less populated than their grandparents' generation. The psychological and economic effects ripple forward for centuries. The epidemiological lessons are stark. Yersinia pestis is a highly virulent pathogen with efficient transmission mechanisms. Without modern medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, public health infrastructure, plague epidemics are catastrophic. The medieval response, isolation, quarantine, fleeing infected areas, was partially effective. The cities that implemented strict quarantines early experienced somewhat reduced mortality. The individuals who fled to isolated rural areas before exposure sometimes survived. But without understanding the actual transmission mechanism, medieval societies couldn't implement fully effective prevention. Modern plague outbreaks are controllable. We have antibiotics that treat Yersinia pestis infections. We have insecticides that kill flea vectors. We have public health systems that can track and contain outbreaks. Plague still exists. It's endemic in some rodent populations. Occasional human cases occur, but it's no longer a civilization-threatening pandemic. This is progress. The difference between medieval mortality rates approaching 60% and modern mortality rates below 10% with treatment. The difference between 3 years of continental catastrophe and localized outbreaks contained within weeks. We stand on their suffering. Every advance in epidemiology, public health, and medicine built on understanding what went wrong in 1347. The plague taught us, through horrific demonstration, why disease surveillance matters, why understanding transmission mechanisms matters, why rapid response matters. The social changes triggered by the Black Death shaped the modern world. The weakening of feudalism, the rise of labor power, the questioning of institutional authority, the increased social mobility. These changes, born from catastrophe, created conditions for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the eventual emergence of democratic governance and individual rights. You could argue, and historians do argue, that the Black Death was a hinge point in Western history. The medieval world died with plague victims in 1347 through 1350. The early modern world emerged from the ruins. This doesn't mean the plague was good or necessary for progress. That's survivor bias and post hoc rationalization. The millions who died experienced only suffering, not social transformation. The changes that emerged were adaptations to catastrophe, not intended outcomes. But the changes did happen. The world of 1360 was fundamentally different from the world of 1340. The society that emerged had to adapt to demographic collapse, labor shortage, institutional failure, and collective trauma. The medical legacy is particularly significant. The Black Death exposed the inadequacy of humoral theory in Galenic medicine. It didn't immediately overturn those frameworks that took centuries, but it planted seeds of doubt. The physicians who survived knew their treatments failed. Some doubled down on traditional approaches. Others began questioning, experimenting, seeking new knowledge. The tradition of medical empiricism, testing treatments, observing outcomes, adjusting based on results, gained strength from plague experiences. The eventual emergence of germ theory in the 1800s, the development of antibiotics in the 1900s. The modern understanding of epidemiology, all of this traces intellectual lineage back to physicians struggling to understand plague in the 1300s. The religious impact was profound and contradictory. Some people became more devout, they survived through divine grace, they owed their lives to God. Others lost faith, if God permits such horror. What kind of God is that? The institutional church's authority weakened. When prayers didn't stop the plague, when priests died alongside everyone else, when the church's explanations proved inadequate, people questioned. Not universally, the church remained powerful for centuries, but the questions emerged. The Protestant Reformation of the 1500s has intellectual roots in the late medieval period, including plague-era questioning of church authority. The catastrophic failure of religious explanations and responses in 1347 through 1350 contributed to the climate that eventually produced Luther, Calvin, and the fracturing of Western Christianity. The economic transformation reshaped Europe, the shift from land-based wealth to labor-based wealth, the rise of urban centers, the increased importance of skilled trades, the emergence of wage labor markets. These changes, accelerated by plague-induced labor shortage, created the economic foundations of early capitalism. The enclosure movement in England, the conversion of common lands to private property, was partly driven by post-plague labor economics. Lords needed to maximize efficiency with reduced labor forces. Sheep farming, which required less labor than crop farming, became more attractive. Common lands were enclosed, peasant farmers were displaced, a landless labor force emerged that would eventually staff factories during the Industrial Revolution. Again, this isn't teleology. The plague didn't cause the Industrial Revolution, but it triggered economic changes that set conditions for later developments. The connections are indirect, but real. The artistic and cultural legacy is visible in everything from Boccaccio's Decameron to Bergman's The Seventh Seal. The plague became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of mortality, catastrophe, and human vulnerability. The imagery death as a skeleton, the dance of death. Plague doctors with bird beak masks remains instantly recognizable centuries later. The literature of memento mori, remember you must die, flourished in post-plague Europe. Not morbid nihilism, but realistic acknowledgement of mortality's inevitability. When you've watched half your community die in weeks, you develop a certain perspective on life's fragility. The psychological legacy is harder to quantify, but no less real. Collective trauma on this scale doesn't disappear in one generation. The survivors pass their trauma to their descendants in stories, in behaviors, in worldviews shaped by catastrophe. The anxious parents who overprotect their young ones because they remember losing siblings to plague. The communities that maintain emergency food stores because they remember starvation during social breakdown. The lingering distrust of authority because institutions failed during crisis. These patterns persist for generations. Modern pandemic responses are COVID-19 experiences in 2020 through 2022 echo medieval plague responses in unsettling ways. The initial denial, the scramble for understanding, the public health measures, the economic disruption, the scapegoating of minorities, the conspiracy theories, the social breakdown. The differences are significant. We have vaccines, treatments, scientific understanding that medieval people lacked. Our mortality rates were nowhere near plague levels. But the human responses, the fear, the adaptation, the resilience, the failure to always act rationally remain remarkably similar. We like to think we're fundamentally different from medieval people. More educated, more rational, more advanced. The pandemic demonstrated we're not as different as we'd like to believe. We're still humans facing infectious disease, still struggling with uncertainty and fear, still making both good and terrible decisions under pressure. The Black Death teaches us humility. It shows us what can happen when a highly virulent pathogen encounters a vulnerable population. It demonstrates how quickly social structures can collapse under pressure. It reveals both the worst and the best of human nature, the scapegoating and the self-sacrifice, the panic and the resilience. Patient zero in Messina, whoever they were, sailor or dock worker or random resident, had no idea what they were unleashing. They were just another sick person in a world full of diseases. They couldn't have known that the bacteria multiplying in their lymph nodes would kill millions, would reshape civilizations, would echo through centuries. The responsibility wasn't theirs. They were a victim, not a villain. The tragedy was in the biology Yersinia pestis meeting a naive population without immunity or medical capacity to respond. The tragedy was in the vector's trade routes that became transmission routes. The tragedy was in the randomness, who lived, who died, why one family survived while another perished. The real patient zero wasn't in Messina. It was somewhere in Central Asia, in rodent populations where plague is endemic. The disease had existed for millennia. Humans had encountered it before. The plague of Justinian in the 500s likely was Yersinia pestis. But the 1347 outbreak occurred at a perfect confluence. Dense urban populations, extensive trade networks, no medical understanding, no effective treatments. The medieval people who endured this, the physicians who tried and failed, the priests who provided comfort, the corpse collectors who risked death daily, the parents who watched their young ones die, The survivors who rebuilt from ruins, they deserve more than our pity. They deserve our respect. They faced horror beyond our comprehension with the tools and knowledge they had. They made mistakes, terrible mistakes, like the scapegoating of Jews. They sometimes failed to live up to their better natures. But they also demonstrated profound courage, compassion, and resilience. The physician who kept treating patients, knowing treatment was futile but couldn't abandon them to die alone. The nun who nursed the sick despite knowing she'd probably contract the disease. The civic official who stayed at his post trying to maintain order when he could have fled. The parent who cared for dying family members with tenderness despite exhaustion and grief. These acts of courage and compassion happened millions of times during the plague years. They're less documented than the catastrophes. Humanity's worst moments get more attention than our best, but they were just as real. The survivors who rebuilt, who formed new families, who reconstructed communities, who found meaning after loss demonstrated that humans can endure almost anything and still find reasons to keep living. What can we learn from all this? Several things. First, infectious disease is a permanent human challenge. Plague hasn't disappeared. New diseases emerge. Maintaining public health infrastructure isn't optional, it's existential. Second, scapegoating during crisis is a recurring pattern. When people are afraid and seeking explanations, they target vulnerable minorities. Recognizing this pattern is the first step to preventing it. Third, social structures are more fragile than they appear. What seems permanent and stable can collapse rapidly under pressure. This should make us both cautious about the structures we depend on and thoughtful about building resilient systems. Fourth, human resilience is real. People can survive incomprehensible horror and rebuild. This isn't minimizing the suffering. It's acknowledging the strength it took to continue living after such loss. Fifth, progress is possible but not inevitable. We have tools medieval people lacked. We can prevent and treat plague. But we have to choose to use those tools, to fund public health, to act collectively rather than purely individually. Today, take a moment to appreciate modern medicine, the antibiotics that treat bacterial infections, the vaccines that prevent diseases, the public health systems that track outbreaks, the medical knowledge that saves millions of lives annually. Be grateful for flush toilets, for clean water, for sanitation systems that prevent disease transmission, for pest control that limits rat and flea populations. Be grateful that when you get sick, you have treatment options beyond bloodletting and prayer. That when epidemics emerge, we have response mechanisms beyond mass graves and quarantine. These aren't guarantees. Systems can fail. We've seen pandemic responses fall short, but we have capabilities that would seem miraculous to medieval physicians. The people of 1347 deserved better than what happened to them. They deserved medical knowledge that could save them. They deserved public health systems that could contain the outbreak. They deserved to live full lives, to watch their young ones grow, to die peacefully of old age rather than plague at 30. They didn't get that. They got catastrophe, suffering, and mass death. But they endured. They survived. They rebuilt. They passed on life to the next generation despite everything. We exist because they persevered. Every one of us with European ancestry is descended from plague survivors. The DNA of resilience runs through our veins because our ancestors were the ones who lived when millions died. Their memory deserves honoring, not just as victims of historical catastrophe, but as humans who faced the unimaginable and found ways to maintain their humanity. Who cared for the sick? Who buried the dead? Who rebuilt civilization from ruins? Who chose hope despite every reason for despair? The Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people, but humanity survived. Civilization survived. Knowledge accumulated. We learned slowly, imperfectly, at terrible cost, but we learned. We learned that disease has natural causes, not supernatural ones. We learned that understanding transmission mechanisms saves lives. We learn that collective action during crisis matters. We learn that institutional resilience requires maintenance. We learn that scapegoating is both wrong and counterproductive. We're still learning. COVID-19 taught us new lessons about pandemic response, social behavior, scientific communication, political decision-making, Future pandemics will teach more lessons, hopefully at lower cost than the Black Death. The fire has burned down to embers. The night is ending. Dawn approaches. We've traveled from October 1347 in Messina through 3 years of continental catastrophe to the aftermath and beyond. We've witnessed Patient Zero's arrival. We've seen the plague spread. We've examined medical failure, social breakdown, scapegoating, and resilience. We've traced the long-term consequences that reshaped European civilization. We've spent 2.5 hours together examining one of history's darkest periods. The medieval people we've discussed lived through this reality. They didn't have the comfort of historical distance. For them, it was immediate, terrifying, all-consuming. They deserve our remembrance. They deserve our respect for their suffering. They deserve acknowledgement for their resilience. They deserve recognition that their lives mattered, that their deaths weren't meaningless statistics, that they were real humans with hopes and fears and loves and losses. To the millions who died in the Black Death, your suffering is not forgotten. Your lives had value. You endured what we can barely imagine. You deserve to be remembered, not just as plague victims, but as people who lived, who loved, who mattered. To the survivors who rebuilt, thank you for persevering. Thank you for choosing life after such death. Thank you for passing on civilization to the next generation. We exist because of your resilience. The fire is dimming now. The story is told. The journey is complete. Until next time, traveler, may you never face what they faced. May you never endure what they endured. And may you remember their suffering so that we might learn from it. The campfire is dying. The night belongs to memory now. Thank you for walking this dark path with me. Be grateful for modern medicine. Be grateful for clean water. Be grateful for the knowledge that saves lives daily. Be grateful you live in an age where plague is treatable, not inevitable. The fire has gone out. The tale is finished. The night ends. Until we meet again by the campfire, traveler. Until the next dark chapter of history calls us, be well. Be safe. Remember them. The night is over. Dawn comes.